Welcome to the Silent Empires, a quiet corner of the night where stories unfold softly, and every shadow hides a deeper meaning. Here, the world slows down for a while. No chaos, no interruptions, just calm, immersive storytelling for the people who enjoy the silence as much as the story itself. If this story kept you company tonight, take a moment to like the video. And in the comments, tell me something simple. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Every night, this channel connects people from different places through the same voice, the same darkness, and the same quiet moment. Television cameras crowd the steps of the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. It is the late 1980s, and the city's fascination with organized crime has reached a fever pitch. Reporters shout questions into the cold air. Boom microphones hover over a crush of bodies. Sketch artists hustle to capture faces that have become symbols in the nightly news. At the center of it all, one figure quietly slips through the commotion. He is not the man the tabloids call the Teflon Don, not the flamboyant boss whose picture sells newspapers. This man is older, his hair thinned and neatly combed, his expression unreadable. He walks with the calm of someone who has spent a lifetime in the shadows. In the government's case, he is introduced to the jury as underboss of the Gambino crime family, Joseph Armone. While cameras focus mostly on his more famous co-defendant, prosecutors speak of Armone as a trusted strategist of an organization built on extortion, illegal gambling, and other serious offenses that have damaged lives and communities for decades. To understand how this unassuming, aging New Yorker ended up at the heart of one of the most scrutinized criminal trials of his era, it is necessary to turn away from the courtroom lights and travel back to the crowded streets that shaped him, to a city and a generation forged in poverty, prejudice, and the temptations of illicit opportunity. Joseph Armone was born on August 13, 1917, in New York City, into a world still absorbing one wave of immigration after another. His family was part of the vast Italian diaspora that had poured into the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Like hundreds of thousands of others, they arrived in a city that promised work yet offered little real welcome. Italians were crowded into dense tenement neighborhoods, often segregated not only by nationality, but by region and village from the old country. The Armone family's precise early addresses shift in surviving records, but they were part of that urban landscape where languages mixed in the stairwells and clotheslines crisscrossed the sky. In these neighborhoods, life was a daily negotiation with hardship. Tenements were noisy, often unsanitary, with thin walls and shared toilets. Children learned early how much their parents worried about rent, food, and the next paycheck. Italian immigrants were often relegated to the lowest paid jobs: dock work, construction, street vending, while facing open discrimination from employers, landlords, and even police. Newspapers of the time routinely characterized them with crude stereotypes. Italian could be shorthand for unwanted, untrustworthy, or dangerous, and that prejudice was reflected in how quickly suspicion fell on them whenever a crime made headlines. Joseph was one of several children, and the Armone household, like so many around them, was shaped by the old world emphasis on family loyalty and the new world pressure to survive. There is no detailed diary of his upbringing, no set of letters that records his private thoughts, but census entries and later law enforcement files agree on the broad outline. An Italian-American boy raised in a working-class environment where education, while theoretically available, competed with the pull of street culture and the urgent need to contribute to the family income. An older brother, Stephen, known later in underworld circles as Stefano or Steve, would eventually become a significant figure in organized crime himself. That older brother's trajectory would cast a long shadow over Joseph's choices. Outside the tight confines of their home, New York City in Joseph's childhood was changing rapidly. When he was just a toddler, the United States embarked on one of the most consequential social experiments of the 20th century, prohibition. In 1920, the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages were outlawed nationwide. The law was supposed to uplift public morals and strengthen families. In practice, it created a vast black market that professionalized and empowered existing criminal groups. For young boys in Italian neighborhoods, the effects were visible on their own streets. Illegal drinking spots, or speakeasies, flourished in back rooms and basements. Trucks delivered not only fruit and vegetables but sometimes barrels and crates whose contents were whispered about but rarely named. Men with money and influence who did not come from respectable business families suddenly appeared, and they were not shy about displaying their success. It was during this period that Italian-dominated underworld organizations began to consolidate in New York. By the time Joseph was a teenager, older figures like Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano had fought what became known as the Castallano War, a bloody conflict among Italian gangs for control of rackets across the city. The war ended in 1931 and gave rise to the structure that would dominate New York organized crime for the rest of the century, the Commission and the Five Families. One of those families, initially led by Vincent Mangano, operated largely in Brooklyn and parts of Manhattan. It would later be renamed after one of its subsequent leaders, Carlo Gambino. That organization, through the actions of men like the Armone brothers, would play a central role in Joseph's adult life. For boys growing up in and around these areas, the underworld was not an abstract idea from pulp novels. It was a visible presence. Some of the best-dressed men at neighborhood social clubs, the ones who always seemed to have cash and who commanded a certain fearful respect, were connected to those organizations. At the same time, local residents often felt trapped between them and the authorities. Police raids could be rough and indiscriminate. Legitimate workers might be shaken down by both corrupt officials and criminal groups. For many families, the line between patron and predator was blurred. Some sought protection or loans from local figures tied to organized crime because mainstream institutions would not serve them. Others tried to keep their distance, understanding that any benefit came at a social cost and carried risks. In that charged environment, Joseph grew into adolescence during the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 and the economic collapse that followed made a harsh life even more precarious. Unemployment surged, and Italian Americans, already marginalized, found themselves at the back of hearing lines. For a young man attempting to carve out a path, the range of appealing legal options narrowed. New Deal programs offered some relief, but they did not erase the deep inequalities that structured the city's labor market. As the 1930s dragged on, many in Joseph's generation bounced between odd jobs, on construction sites, in warehouses, around the docks, and informal street economies that skirted or crossed the line into illegality. Surviving accounts from law enforcement and later court testimony indicate that Joseph's older brother Stephen entered organized crime before Joseph did, aligning himself with factions that would come under the umbrella of the future Gambino family. Stephen is identified in post-war investigative reports as a caporgine, a mid-level leader entrusted with overseeing a crew of men involved in illegal activities such as gambling and drug trafficking. These reports rarely dwell on domestic scenes, but it is clear that in the Armone family, Stephen's status, as someone who commanded both fear and respect in the neighborhood, was a constant, and Joseph grew up observing his older brother's world. By Joseph's late teens and early 20s, authorities would later list him in investigative documents as an associate of that same organization. What that meant in practice in those years was that he gravitated toward the social clubs, bars, and street corners where members and associates of the Mangano family conducted business. These places were part social hub, part informal office, with card games in the back, drinks at the bar, and quiet conversations about debt collection or business opportunities. Oral histories from people who lived in similar neighborhoods at the time describe how younger men were often given incremental tasks, running errands, serving as lookouts, or helping to collect money from local bookmakers or small-time gamblers. While specific anecdotes about Joseph's early activities are sparse, his later status and the timing of his emergence in police files suggest a gradual deepening of involvement, one that followed a pattern common in those communities. The transition from casual association to more committed participation in organized crime was rarely marked by a single dramatic moment. Instead, it tended to unfold as a series of decisions and accommodations. A young man might be offered work protecting a local store from vandalism, with the implication that those causing the damage were answerable to the very people selling protection. He might be asked to help enforce an unpaid gambling debt, not with overt violence but with persistent visits and implied consequences. The money for such work often exceeded what could be earned in the legal job market, especially during periods of economic downturn or discrimination. As the sums grew, so did the expectations and the risks. At the same time, the American state was expanding its reach. The end of Prohibition in 1933 forced criminal groups to pivot away from bootlegging and toward other revenue streams. Illegal gambling, labor racketeering, and narcotics became increasingly important. Police and federal agencies, learning from the mistakes of the Prohibition era, were slowly developing more sophisticated approaches to investigating organized crime. Wiretaps, undercover operations, and coordinated interagency task forces would all, in time, become tools used against the likes of Joseph Armone. But in the 1930s and early 1940s, these methods were still in their infancy, and organized crime figures often operated with a sense that the law was, at worst, a manageable obstacle. World War II added another layer to this landscape. Between 1941 and 1945, millions of American men served in the armed forces or in wartime industries. Many Italian-American families had sons in uniform, fighting for a country that had not always accepted them. Public attitudes toward Italian immigrants shifted somewhat during the war as their contribution to the war effort became more visible. Within the underworld, the war years brought their own changes. Some figures used wartime shortages and black markets to their advantage. Others exploited connections to docks and shipping lines, gaining leverage in areas that would remain lucrative long after the war ended. The historical record does not provide a detailed, documented account of Joseph Armone's activities during those specific years, but by the time peace returned, he was clearly operating within networks that had only grown wealthier and more entrenched. The post-war period, especially the late 1940s, was a turning point for organized crime in New York. Prosperity returned to much of the country, but the structures of discrimination that had hemmed in Italian-American communities did not vanish overnight. Sharply limited upward mobility, lingering prejudice, and the lure of quickly obtained money continued to make criminal organizations appear attractive to some young men. At the upper levels, the five families solidified their territories and adjusted to post-war realities. The Mangano family controlled important waterfront and labor rackets, leveraging the constant flow of goods through New York's ports. Its leadership, however, was not stable. In 1951, boss Vincent Mangano disappeared and his brother was found dead. Into that vacuum stepped Albert Anastasia, a figure feared even by other mobsters for his reputation. The organizations that Joseph and Stephen were part of thus moved under new leadership, and loyalty to that shifting hierarchy became both an expectation and a survival strategy. Within this environment, Joseph's name began appearing more regularly in investigative materials. Federal agents tracking narcotics and customs violations, city detectives monitoring gambling and loan sharking, and state-level task forces mapping the structure of Italian-American organized crime all encountered references to him. He was typically identified not as a street-level thug, but as someone trusted to handle money, logistics, and sensitive conversations, roles that required discretion and reliability within the culture of Cosa Nostra. One constant in these reports is that he was often mentioned alongside his brother Stephen, reinforcing the idea that family connections were both a path into and a binding element within the criminal world they inhabited. Despite the aura of power and influence that surrounded men like the Armone brothers, life in these circles was anything but secure. Alliances shifted, law enforcement pressure ebbed and flowed. The same system that offered protection and illegal income could also turn inward with lethal results when loyalty was questioned. Although public attention often focused on the flamboyant or violent elements of organized crime, much of the work was unglamorous. Long hours in smoky social clubs, tedious accounting of gambling operations, and constant vigilance against both informants and rivals. For someone like Joseph, upward mobility within this world demanded a combination of caution, obedience to superiors, and a willingness to participate in activities that harmed others, whether by exploiting their addictions, trapping them in cycles of debt, or corrupting institutions meant to serve the public. By the early 1950s, when Joseph was in his 30s, the trajectory of his life had diverged sharply from that of many of his childhood peers, who had found more conventional paths in factories, small businesses, or civil service. He was deeply embedded in the operations of a powerful criminal organization that law enforcement and the press were only beginning to comprehend in full. Newspapers occasionally mentioned his name in connection with raids or arrests of others, but he did not yet command the notoriety that would follow decades later. Instead, he was one of many figures operating at a level visible enough to be noted in investigative files, yet still largely anonymous to the broader public. This anonymity, however, was not to last. As authorities intensified their efforts against organized crime in the mid-1950s, with new laws, commissions of inquiry, and cross-border investigations, the activities of men like Joseph Armone came under closer scrutiny. Federal agencies began tracing the flow of money and contraband with more persistence and technical skill than before. The comfortable distance that once insulated many mid-level figures from serious legal consequences started to shrink. In that tightening net, the decisions Joseph had made, from his early embrace of the influence of his brother's world to his deepening integration into the Mangano and later Gambino hierarchy, would soon draw him into direct confrontation with the full force of the American justice system. In the early 1950s, the New York criminal landscape that had shaped Joseph Armone's formative years was entering a period of upheaval. At the top of his world, the Mangano family, one of the city's 5 families, was rocked by internal conflict. Boss Vincent Mangano disappeared in 1951, never to be officially found, while his brother Philip was murdered and dumped in a marsh. In their place rose Albert Anastasia, a man whose name already carried a dark reputation in law enforcement files. For the Armone brothers, still operating far below that lofty level, the change in leadership did not alter the basic mechanics of their daily existence. They were still part of an Italian-American underworld that controlled gambling dens, bookmaking networks, and labor rackets along the docks and in certain unions. But with Anastasia's rise, the atmosphere grew more volatile, and the stakes, for everyone involved, rose accordingly. Anastasia's tenure was brief. By 1957, powerful figures within the mafia were alarmed by his increasingly unpredictable behavior and by the scrutiny his notoriety brought from law enforcement. That autumn, he was assassinated in a midtown Manhattan barbershop, an event that made headlines worldwide and further confirmed to police and federal investigators that beneath the surface of New York's supposed secret societies, there were very real struggles for power. Out of that turmoil emerged Carlo Gambino, a quieter, more calculating figure who assumed control of the family that would eventually bear his name. Under Gambino, the organization's leadership became more discreet, less prone to public theatrics. Profit and stability, rather than dramatic displays of violence, were the order of the day. For men like Joseph and his older brother Stephen, that shift rewarded exactly the qualities they were known to possess: caution, reliability, and a steady focus on business. By this time, Joseph was no longer a marginal neighborhood figure. Law enforcement files from the mid-1950s place him firmly within the orbit of the Gambino family's operations. He appeared in surveillance reports about social clubs in Brooklyn and Manhattan, was identified as a frequent companion of known Gambino members, and was occasionally detained during raids, even when not formally charged. The pattern of these mentions is revealing. He was typically described as calm, low-key, and reluctant to speak when questioned. Unlike some contemporaries who cultivated flamboyant personas, Joseph preferred to keep his head down. This discretion made him useful to his superiors and complicated the work of investigators trying to piece together the inner workings of the organization. While gambling and loan sharking remained major sources of income for the Gambino family, the 1950s also saw a growing law enforcement focus on a more insidious and socially destructive enterprise: the narcotics trade. Heroin in particular was causing profound harm in American cities, and authorities traced a significant portion of the supply back to Italian and Sicilian networks that worked in tandem with American crime families. The Bureau of Narcotics, a federal agency that predated today's Drug Enforcement Administration, began assembling long-term investigations that sought not merely to arrest street-level dealers, but to identify the transnational pipelines bringing drugs from overseas into U.S. communities. In the course of these investigations, the names of Stephen and Joseph Armone surfaced repeatedly. According to federal agents, later testimony and declassified reports, Stephen was viewed as a key intermediary between overseas suppliers and American distribution chains. His position as a Gambino family captain provided him access to capital, protection, and logistical support. Joseph, in these accounts, was depicted as a trusted associate involved in coordinating shipments, handling finances, and maintaining secure communication among participants. The shipping routes detailed in court documents and investigative summaries read like a grim atlas of opportunity. Raw materials sourced in the Middle East, processed in parts of Europe, then moved by ship or air cargo to North America. From there, they were broken down into smaller quantities for distribution in cities across the United States. While the exact degree of Joseph's responsibility within this system is described with varying emphasis in different sources, there is no doubt that he was considered by federal authorities to be an important figure within a scheme that contributed to widespread addiction, family breakdown, and community destabilization. The same year Anastasia was killed and Gambino assumed control of the family, 1957, another event further weakened the veil of secrecy around organized crime. In November, state troopers in rural Appalachian, New York, stumbled upon, or according to some accounts, were tipped off to, a gathering of dozens of high-ranking mafia figures from across the country. The raid on that meeting became a national story, prompting ridicule in some quarters and alarm in others. It shattered the long-maintained public fiction that there was no national structure to organized crime. Congressional committees and federal agencies seized on the Appalachian revelations to justify expanded investigations. In the years that followed, the names of many men who had attended that meeting would appear in newly aggressive federal indictments. Even though Joseph himself was not publicly identified as an attendee, the heightened scrutiny that followed Appalachian reached deep into the networks with which he was associated. Throughout the late 1950s, the Bureau of Narcotics and allied agencies methodically built cases targeting alleged heroin traffickers connected to the Gambino family and other New York organizations. Agents conducted wiretaps under then-existing laws, tailed suspects from social clubs to shipping facilities, and cultivated informants, often individuals facing their own legal jeopardy who hoped to reduce their sentences by providing information. The investigations were painstaking and, for the targets, largely invisible until the moment of arrest. Joseph and Stephen, accustomed to periodic police attention in relation to gambling or local rackets, might have recognized that they were under a measure of surveillance. But the full scope of the government's interest became evident only when they were named in federal narcotics indictments toward the end of the decade. Those indictments, filed in federal court in New York, alleged that the Armone brothers and numerous associates had participated in conspiracies to import and distribute heroin on a significant scale, with drugs routed from the Middle East and Europe into the United States. The government's narrative, as presented in subsequent trials, painted a picture of a meticulously organized enterprise. Coded telephone calls referring obliquely to merchandise, clandestine meetings in cafes and apartments, and a chain of couriers and intermediaries who shuttled between continents. Defense attorneys countered that much of the evidence was circumstantial, that informants were unreliable, and that the government was stretching to connect legitimate travel and business activity to criminal conduct. In courtroom arguments and legal briefs, Joseph was presented by his lawyers as a hardworking family man, unfairly targeted because of his last name and the neighborhood from which he came. Regardless of the defense's framing, the context of the era worked against defendants in such cases. Public anxiety about narcotics was high, and lawmakers, responding to growing concern about addiction and its social effects, had recently toughened federal drug laws. Judges were given less latitude to impose lenient sentences, and prosecutors were incentivized to pursue conspiracy charges that allowed them to present a broad narrative of organized wrongdoing, rather than focusing on any single transaction. In that atmosphere, Joseph's fate was increasingly likely to be decided not only by the facts of his specific actions, but by the broader determination of American institutions to confront what they described as an organized crime-narcotics nexus. The legal proceedings arising from these investigations stretched on for years, encompassing pretrial motions, challenges to the admissibility of wiretap evidence, disputes over witness credibility, and complex jury instructions about conspiracy law. Joseph, who was in his early 40s when the process began, spent much of this period traveling back and forth to courtrooms flanked by attorneys, listening as federal agents reconstructed parts of his life in a language of dates, phone logs, and surveillance reports. He denied the allegations, as did many of his co-defendants. Yet in the early 1960s, after extended litigation, he was convicted on serious narcotics charges in federal court. The sentence imposed was lengthy, reflecting both the gravity with which the law viewed heroin trafficking and the government's belief that he had occupied a significant role within the operation. With that judgment, the trajectory of Joseph's life shifted abruptly from the smoky social clubs and crowded Brooklyn streets he had long known to the structured, controlled environment of the federal prison system. For a man deeply embedded in a culture that prized autonomy, personal networks, and the subtle power of unspoken understandings, incarceration was both a practical and symbolic blow. He was removed not only from his day-to-day involvement in Gambino family business, but from the informal web of influence and obligation that he had spent decades cultivating. His brother Stephen, meanwhile, continued to operate outside, navigating the pressures on the Gambino organization during Joseph's absence. Reliable first-hand accounts of Joseph's years in prison are scarce. Inmates did not typically publish memoirs detailing the inner workings of mob hierarchies during that era, and those who later cooperated with authorities often focused more on their own stories than on the quiet routines of others. Still, some inferences can be drawn from patterns common to imprisoned members of organized crime groups. Family visits, when allowed, were a lifeline, maintaining both emotional connections and the organizational bonds that linked imprisoned men to their former associates. Reading, routine exercise, and the informal social order of the prison yard structured daily life. For someone like Joseph, whose reputation within the Gambino family depended on perceived loyalty and steadiness under pressure, demonstrating calm acceptance of his sentence and refraining from cooperation with authorities would have been central to preserving standing beyond the prison walls. Outside, the landscape Joseph had left behind was undergoing significant transformation. In 1963, a low-ranking but historically consequential figure named Joseph Valachi testified before a United States Senate committee, becoming the first acknowledged member of the American Mafia to publicly describe its structure, rituals, and chain of command. While some details of Valachi's testimony were later questioned or corrected, his appearance marked a turning point in how the government and the public understood organized crime. Terms like Cosa Nostra, boss, underboss, and consigliere entered mainstream discourse. For law enforcement, Valachi's information provided a framework for interpreting the kinds of associations and meetings that had figured in cases like those against the Armone brothers. For imprisoned figures like Joseph, the hearings were a reminder that the veil of secrecy surrounding their world had been permanently weakened. The impact of narcotics on American society also continued to grow during Joseph's years of incarceration. What had been described in the 1950s as a largely urban problem affecting specific communities expanded in the 1960s into a more widely recognized national crisis. Heroin use rose in many cities and among segments of the counterculture, prompting further calls for tough enforcement and shaping the eventual development of the war on drugs in the following decade. In news coverage and political speeches, organized crime was repeatedly singled out as a major driver of this crisis. The kinds of operations in which prosecutors had accused Joseph and Stephen of participation were now framed not only as criminal conspiracies, but as assaults on the nation's health and security. Within the Gambino family itself, power continued to flow through familiar channels even as external pressure mounted. Carlo Gambino, wary of drawing attention, maintained a low public profile, rarely appearing in newspapers except when summoned before grand juries or questioned by investigators. Inside the organization, he cultivated a reputation for careful decision-making and for rewarding those who remained loyal through legal entanglements. When members or associates like Joseph received substantial prison terms but refused to cooperate with authorities, it was widely understood that their families would receive financial support and that, upon release, they would be given opportunities to regain a place in the family's operations. These unwritten assurances helped maintain internal discipline and discourage defection even under intense legal pressure. The late 1960s brought personal changes for Joseph as well. His brother Stephen, long a significant figure in Gambino family narcotics operations and a key point of reference in Joseph's life, died before the decade was out. The exact circumstances of his death, while noted in law enforcement and journalistic sources, were far less sensational than those that often accompanied organized crime killings. He did not fall victim to a high-profile hit that splashed across front pages. Yet his absence nonetheless altered the constellation of relationships awaiting Joseph on the outside. The elder brother who had first navigated the path into organized crime, and whose status had provided both guidance and a measure of protection, was no longer there. Legal developments also affected Joseph's status as the 1960s drew to a close. Appellate courts, reassessing aspects of federal narcotics prosecutions, including the use of certain types of electronic surveillance and the interpretation of conspiracy statutes, issued decisions that complicated some older convictions. In a number of cases, including those involving organized crime figures, higher courts ordered new trials or overturned specific counts. The precise procedural history of Joseph's case is complex, and different sources emphasize different legal turning points. But there is broad agreement that these appellate decisions shortened the effective length of his incarceration compared to his original sentence. By the turn of the 1970s, he was no longer behind bars. Emerging from prison after years in federal custody, Joseph returned to a New York that had changed markedly since the mid-1950s. New styles, new political movements, and new forms of crime and law enforcement had reshaped the city. Yet in certain neighborhoods, the corner social clubs, discreet restaurants, and coded ways of speaking that characterized the Gambino family's presence remained familiar. Carlo Gambino was still in charge, overseeing an organization that, while challenged by law enforcement, remained powerful in construction, trucking, and other sectors, and continued to profit from illegal gambling and other activities. For a man like Joseph, who had paid a heavy price in prison and had maintained his silence, the question now was not whether he would re-enter that world. Evidence suggests that his loyalty was never in serious doubt, but what role he would occupy in a hierarchy that had evolved during his absence. The answer would, over the next decade, draw him steadily upward. His experience, his perceived steadfastness under pressure, and the respect he commanded among those who remembered both his past work and his refusal to turn on his associates made him an asset in an organization that prized precisely such attributes. Yet the same qualities that brought him renewed influence also drew renewed attention from the state. For law enforcement agencies that had spent the 1960s learning from past missteps and developing more sophisticated techniques, Joseph's return to the streets marked not the end of a story, but the beginning of a new, more closely watched chapter in the long struggle between the Gambino family and the institutions determined to hold its members accountable. When Joseph walked out of federal custody around the turn of the 1970s, he re-entered a world that had not forgotten him. Inside the Gambino organization, his long silence in the face of a serious narcotics conviction had meaning. In a culture where cooperation with the government was the ultimate betrayal, a man who absorbed a heavy sentence and returned without having testified against others was marked as dependable. That reputation, built in courtrooms and prison yards rather than in the back rooms of social clubs, now became one of his most valuable assets. Men who had been younger associates when he went away were now experienced soldiers. Some of the figures who had loomed over his early life were dead or retired. Yet the unwritten rules that governed the organization and the value placed on loyalty were largely unchanged. Carlo Gambino still sat at the top of the family that now bore his name. In the years Joseph had been away, Gambino had done what he was known to do best: avoid headlines while quietly expanding his control over lucrative sectors of New York's economy. The family exerted influence in garment trucking, the Fulton Fish Market, waste hauling, and especially in construction, areas where the line between legitimate business and criminal exploitation could be deliberately blurred. Beneath Gambino, the family's underboss, Aniello Neil Delacroce, anchored the more traditional street operations, presiding over social clubs in Little Italy and elsewhere that served as hubs for gambling and loan sharking. It was into this structure that Joseph returned, no longer merely a name in older narcotics files, but a man whose conduct had been tested in the harshest way his world knew. Law enforcement had not stood still either. In 1970, the U.S. Congress had passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, a sweeping law that transformed the legal battlefield for organized crime. Prosecutors were no longer limited to charging individual crimes in isolation. Under RICO, they could present a pattern of offenses: illegal gambling, extortion, fraud, even acts of violence, as part of an ongoing criminal enterprise, and seek to hold leaders responsible for the actions of subordinates carried out in furtherance of that enterprise. The law allowed for enhanced penalties, asset seizures, and a narrative style of prosecution that fit the complex reality of families like the Gambinos far better than earlier statutes had. For someone in Joseph's position, a seasoned insider returning to a top-heavy organization, RICO, meant that the risks attached to day-to-day operations were now tethered to a larger and potentially more devastating legal framework. From the vantage point of the FBI and the newly energized organized crime strike forces within the Department of Justice, Joseph's reappearance on the streets of New York did not go unnoticed. These units had been created in the late 1960s to coordinate investigations across agencies and jurisdictions, drawing on the lessons of earlier, fragmented efforts. Agents built organizational charts of families like Gambino, updating them as new surveillance reports, informant statements, and arrest records came in. Over the first half of the 1970s, Joseph's name migrated on these charts, from a mere associate in older narcotics cases to a figure described as a caporgine, or captain, in the Gambino hierarchy. In that role, he was believed to oversee a crew of soldiers and associates engaged in the familiar range of rackets: illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion of businesses that operated within the geographic area assigned to him. That area increasingly included portions of Manhattan's West Side and Midtown, zones of intense economic activity where criminal influence could be leveraged into regular income. Investigators monitoring these neighborhoods observed that bars, social clubs, and modest restaurants functioned as informal offices for Gambino captains and lieutenants. Here, bookmakers settled accounts with higher-ups, borrowers made payments on high-interest loans, and business owners with labor or permit problems came to seek help, a euphemism that usually meant paying for the ability to operate without harassment from those very same forces. Federal and local law enforcement reports from the mid-1970s list Joseph as a regular presence in several such establishments, sometimes in the company of Delacroix loyalists, sometimes with younger men who were climbing the ranks. The mechanics of Joseph's alleged operations mirrored those that had helped sustain the family since the Prohibition era. Illegal gambling remained a cornerstone. Bookmakers took bets on sports and horse races. Card and dice games ran in back rooms, with the house taking a cut. On the surface, such activities might seem, to some, less harmful than more overtly predatory offenses, but the impact on participants could be severe. Gamblers who fell into debt often found themselves turning to loan sharks, unlicensed lenders who charged exorbitant interest rates and backed their demands for repayment with persistent pressure and the threat of escalation. In this cycle, a casual bettor could quickly become a desperate debtor, beholden to a network that profited from his distress. Law enforcement sources describe Joseph as one of the figures who, as a captain, had responsibility for ensuring that the money flowed upward from such operations, even if he was rarely, if ever, the person taking bets or knocking on doors himself. Parallel to gambling and loan sharking, the Gambino family pursued influence in labor unions and legitimate industries. Here the harm could spread far beyond individual victims. Through control of certain union locals, mob-connected figures were able to extract payoffs from contractors, manipulate bids, and skim from pension or welfare funds. Workers who should have benefited from union protections sometimes found that their representatives were more answerable to organized crime than to rank-and-file members. While not every such scheme can be tied directly to Joseph, investigative materials from the era consistently place him in the subset of Gambino leaders who had both the seniority and the temperament to manage long-term arrangements with business and union contacts. He appears in surveillance photographs and agent notes from meetings with figures later identified as corrupt union officials or businessmen seeking to ingratiate themselves with the family. These kinds of interactions rarely produced immediate arrests. Part of the challenge for law enforcement was that much of what transpired in these meetings could be framed at least superficially, as legitimate. A restaurant owner consulting a friend about a lease, a contractor dropping by to discuss security for a building site. The coded language that had become standard in such circles further obscured meaning. Agents listening to wiretaps or wearing hidden microphones in bugged locations had to painstakingly decode references, matching cryptic remarks to observed events or financial records. Even when they were confident that extortion or bid rigging was being discussed, the evidentiary bar needed for prosecution was high. Through the 1970s, investigators adopted increasingly intrusive tactics to meet that bar. Court-authorized wiretaps expanded, and the FBI obtained permission to install listening devices inside social clubs and restaurants used by organized crime figures. Some of these operations are now matters of public record, discussed in court opinions and released investigative reports. They reveal an evolving picture of Joseph's role. On tapes from certain Manhattan locations, he is not heard loudly giving orders. Instead, he often speaks in measured tones, offering assessments or relaying information. Others defer to him, suggesting that within his sphere he carried genuine authority. In an underworld that prized restraint and discretion, this low-key style was not a weakness but a strength. The internal politics of the Gambino family also shifted over the course of the decade. In 1972, Carlo Gambino's longtime ally Joseph Biondo died, and other trusted lieutenants aged or left the scene. New faces emerged in leadership positions. Among them was John Gotti, a volatile but ambitious figure who, by the mid-1970s, had established himself as a capable enforcer and earner in the family, particularly through control of a busy Queens-based crew. Gotti gravitated toward Delacroce's orbit in Little Italy, aligning himself with the so-called street faction of the family that placed a premium on traditional rackets and personal loyalties. Joseph, whose own history and connections tied him to that same world, moved in some of the same circles. Contemporary FBI intelligence summaries suggest that by the latter half of the 1970s, Gotti and Armone were in semi-regular contact, though the exact nature of their conversations was not always clear to eavesdropping agents. Carlo Gambino's death in October 1976 triggered a succession that would have lasting repercussions. Rather than elevating his underboss, Delacroce, Gambino designated his cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castallano, as boss. Castallano was known for his interest in white-collar schemes, construction, wholesale food distribution, and other businesses that offered large profits with, he believed, less overt confrontation with the state. Delacroce accepted the subordinate position of underboss under Castallano, preserving a fragile unity, but the division between the white-collar and street wings of the family sharpened. Castallano oversaw meetings at his Staten Island home and in midtown restaurants. Delacroce continued to preside at the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy, a hub for men like Gotti and, increasingly, Joseph. This divided environment, Joseph's experience and reputation as steady under pressure, made him an important bridge figure. He was older than Gotti and many of the ambitious younger captains, with memories that stretched back to the Mangano and Anastasia eras. At the same time, he had demonstrated a willingness to adapt to new realities, surviving a major federal case, accepting the new legal environment, and rebuilding his influence without the overt swagger that attracted newspaper photographers. Agents monitoring the Rave Night and other locales picked up numerous references to him as a respected elder who could be consulted on sensitive matters, whether about dealing with disputes between associates or about interpreting the evolving mood of the upper leadership. Law enforcement interest in Joseph intensified in tandem with his rising internal profile. By the late 1970s, the FBI and U.S. attorneys, offices in the southern and eastern districts of New York had adopted a long-term strategy of building RICO cases aimed not just at individual families, but at the mafia, commission, the informal body that coordinated relations among the five families. To do this, they needed to understand the roles of men like Armone, who, while not at the very top, connected the day-to-day realities of crew operations with the decisions made by bosses and underbosses. Informants, some of them former soldiers or associates facing their own charges, began providing more detailed organizational information. In their accounts, the name Piney or Piney Joe surfaced repeatedly as a Gambino captain trusted by both Delacroix and the rank and file. Yet for all this attention, Joseph managed to avoid the kind of high-profile indictment that periodically disrupted the lives of other family members during this period. Through the 1970s, various Gambino figures were charged in cases involving illegal gambling, labor racketeering, and fraud. Some pleaded guilty, others fought their cases, and, in a few instances, won acquittals. Joseph's name appeared in some indictments as an unindicted co-conspirator, or as a person mentioned in the background narrative, but he was not, for most of that decade, the primary target of a major federal trial. This relative absence from the docket was not for lack of interest on the state's part. Rather, it reflected the difficulty of tying him directly to specific overt acts in a way that would satisfy a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. For the communities in which he operated, however, the effects of the Gambino family's activities were very real. In neighborhoods on Manhattan's West Side, business owners learned, often indirectly, that certain payments were expected if they wanted to avoid labor disruptions, regulatory trouble, or other forms of pressure. In construction zones, contractors understood that hearing decisions and contract awards might be influenced not only by price and quality, but by relationships with mob-linked figures. Ordinary workers, seeking nothing more than a paycheck, sometimes found themselves caught between their need to keep their jobs and their discomfort with the corrupt practices surrounding them. In this ecosystem, Joseph functioned, according to contemporaneous investigative summaries, as one of the intermediaries who translated the general expectations of the Gambino hierarchy into specific instructions and arrangements on the ground. As the 1970s gave way to the early 1980s, the tension within the Gambino family between Castallano's Staten Island-based leadership and Delacroix's Little Italy faction deepened. Castallano's emphasis on low visibility, high-profit ventures did not always sit well with younger captains whose reputations had been built through more traditional means. The distance, both physical and symbolic, between Castallano's world of suburban comfort and the cramped streets where social clubs like the Rave Nights stood became a recurring theme in conversations captured on FBI tapes. In these recordings, which would later be played in courtrooms and aired in documentaries, men in Delacroix's circle could be heard expressing frustration with what they saw as uneven distribution of opportunities and respect. Joseph occupied a delicate place in this brewing conflict. On the one hand, his age and long tenure gave him a natural alignment with older leadership. He had come up in an era when power was exercised quietly and when deference to the boss was expected. On the other hand, his daily interactions were increasingly with men like Gotti, who chafed under Castallano's rule and believed that their earning power and willingness to take risks were not properly acknowledged. Later law enforcement reconstructions of this period depict Joseph as broadly sympathetic to the street faction's grievances, though careful in how openly he voiced such views. Meanwhile, the state's campaign against organized crime entered a new phase. Federal prosecutors secured landmark convictions in cases involving other families, demonstrating that RICO could be used effectively against high-ranking figures. The so-called Pizza Connection case of the early 1980s, which revealed a vast heroin distribution network operating through pizzerias and other businesses, underscored the continuing role of the American mafia in transnational drug trafficking, an area of criminality that had already played a key role in Joseph's own life story. These successes emboldened investigators targeting the Gambino family. They expanded their surveillance net, installed more sophisticated listening devices, and pressed informants for detailed accounts of meetings, money flows, and internal disputes. One consequence of this intensified scrutiny was that private conversations in places Joseph had long treated as sanctuaries were now, unbeknownst to him at the time, being recorded and transcribed. Years later, when some of these transcripts became public as part of trial records, they offered rare glimpses of his demeanor and priorities in the final years before the family plunged into open crisis. He spoke about maintaining discipline within crews, about the importance of not drawing unnecessary attention, and about the need to keep certain disagreements from escalating in ways that would invite intervention from above or from outside. These recorded fragments reinforce the picture of a man who, whatever else could be said about his choices, viewed stability and continuity as core values within his world. But forces beyond his control were converging. Delacroce's health was declining. Castallano, despite his attempts to remain insulated in his Staten Island enclave, was under increasing legal pressure, particularly from investigations into labor racketeering and construction. Younger figures, emboldened by their own success and by what they perceived as the vulnerabilities of the existing leadership, began contemplating more radical solutions to their frustrations. In that atmosphere, the quiet, backroom skills that had carried Joseph through decades of change, his ability to navigate between factions, to keep the machinery of rackets running, and to stay off the front pages, would soon be tested as never before, in a sequence of events that would hurl the Gambino family into the brightest possible spotlight and move Joseph from the relative obscurity of surveillance files into the center of one of the era's most watched criminal dramas. By the mid-1980s, the gap between Paul Castallano's cautious, business-oriented leadership and the frustrations of the so-called street faction inside the Gambino family had become more than a matter of tone. It was a structural fault line. At one end was Castallano himself, running affairs from his Staten Island home and favored midtown restaurants, focusing heavily on construction, wholesale meat distribution, and other comparatively discreet rackets. At the other were men who spent their days in cramped social clubs and crowded neighborhoods, dealing with the rough realities of gambling, loan sharking, and the constant risk of arrest. Joseph Armone was firmly rooted in that second world. He had earned his standing there over decades, and much of his authority flowed from the sense among younger men that he understood their realities in a way Castallano never quite did. Aniello Delacroce, the underboss, was the crucial buffer between these strata. His Rave Night social club on Mulberry Street remained the gravitational center for the street-level wing of the family, a place where captains like Joseph and ambitious younger figures like John Gotti came to talk, pay respect, and sort out disputes. For years, Delacroce's personal loyalty to Castallano and his insistence on discipline had kept deeper resentments from erupting. But Delacroce was ill. By 1985, cancer had weakened him severely. FBI surveillance noted fewer public appearances, and those who did see him remarked on his failing health. His looming absence hung over every quiet conversation at the rave night, every whispered complaint about Castallano's decisions. The legal pressure on Castallano had meanwhile intensified. In 1985, federal prosecutors in Manhattan unveiled one of the most ambitious organized crime cases in American history, a RICO indictment targeting what they described as the commission of the American Mafia. The case alleged that the heads of New York's 5 families, including Castallano, had conspired over years to control labor unions, rig construction bids, and direct a wide array of rackets that extracted money from businesses and workers across the region. The indictment drew directly on the conceptual framework that men like Joseph had seen evolving since the late 1960s. The idea that organized crime was not a series of isolated incidents, but a coordinated criminal enterprise. For Castallano, the commission case was a direct threat to his freedom and his authority. For Gotti and the street captains around him, It was another sign that the boss's strategy of concentrating on supposedly safer, white-collar schemes had not shielded the family from attention. In that tense environment, Delacroce's death on December 2, 1985, removed the one man who had both moral authority and personal inclination to restrain the more confrontational instincts of the street faction. The funeral that followed in Queens was a major event in underworld circles, drawing figures from across the Gambino family and beyond. According to later FBI reports and news accounts, Castallano's absence from that funeral resonated deeply among Delacroce's followers. To them, it was not just a scheduling decision, but a perceived slight to a man they revered. In the weeks that followed, conversations inside social clubs and on bugged telephones turned increasingly to the question of succession and respect. Castallano's reported intentions to reorganize crews loyal to Delacroce, including those linked to Gotti, stirred fears that demotions or reassignments were imminent. Men whose reputations had been built on their earning power and willingness to take risks felt that their status within the family might be diminished. Among them was Joseph, who, by virtue of his age, experience, and earlier sacrifices, expected to be treated as a pillar of that wing of the organization. Federal agents would later testify that informants described him, during this period, as deeply aligned with Delacroce's followers and skeptical of Castallano's leadership, though he was too seasoned to voice such doubts openly to all but a trusted few. On December 16, 1985, events took a dramatic turn that would permanently alter the history of the Gambino family. That evening, Paul Castallano and his driver and bodyguard, Thomas Bilotti, were shot and killed outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. The attack, carried out in view of startled passers-by, sent shockwaves through law enforcement, the media, and the underworld. For decades, the mafia in New York had tended to handle internal power struggles with a degree of discretion aimed at minimizing public disruption. This was different. A brazen removal of a sitting boss in a busy commercial district at rush hour. To investigators, the message was unmistakable. Someone within the Gambino hierarchy had decided that the existing arrangement was intolerable and was willing to risk extraordinary law enforcement attention to change it. Prosecutors and FBI agents would later argue, in court filings and public statements, that John Gotti had been the prime mover behind the decision to kill Castallano, and that a group of key captains from the Delacroce faction had supported him. Those accounts vary in the details of who was consulted, when, and how. Joseph's exact role in the internal deliberations remains less fully documented than that of Gotti or a few other prominent figures. Unlike some men whose later cooperation with authorities produced long, detailed narratives, Joseph never became a government witness. Still, contemporaneous law enforcement reports and later analyses consistently place him in the camp that backed Gotti's assumption of power. In the weeks after Castallano's death, informants described him as one of the senior voices who rallied support for the new order, lending his name and quiet authority to the shift. Within days, the Gambino family's leadership appeared to have stabilized around a new structure. Gotti, in his mid-40s and far more visibly flamboyant than his predecessors, emerged as boss. Frank DeSicco, a longtime Delacroce protege, was named underboss. The consigliere role, traditionally an advisor who served as a sounding board and mediator, was filled by older, respected figures. Joseph's own elevation to the position of underboss would come slightly later, after another abrupt and violent change in leadership. But even in these initial months, there was little doubt inside or outside the family that he had become one of Gotti's closest and most trusted lieutenants. For law enforcement, Castallano's killing and Gotti's rapid ascent confirmed theories they had been developing for some time about internal tensions within the Gambino family. It also provided both an opportunity and a challenge. On the one hand, the very public nature of the assassination drew political attention and spurred demands that agencies redouble efforts against organized crime. On the other, it meant that some of the key figures they had long been investigating were now at the very top of the most powerful mafia family in the United States, increasing the stakes attached to each surveillance operation, indictment, or potential informant. The commission trial proceeded in 1986 against the remaining defendants. Castallano's place at the defense table was, of course, empty. In November of that year, after a months-long presentation that detailed the commission's alleged role in extortion, bid rigging, and other rackets, the jury returned guilty verdicts against all 8 surviving defendants. The trial marked a watershed. It demonstrated that RICO could be used successfully not only against individual families, but against the mafia's broader governing structure. It also sent a clear signal to the next generation of leaders, men like Gotti and his inner circle, including Joseph, that the old assumptions about the limits of law enforcement power were no longer safe. Within the Gambino family, Gotti's initial months as boss were a mix of consolidation and spectacle. He held court at the Rave Night Social Club, drawing crowds of onlookers and attracting the cameras of tabloid photographers who were delighted by his expensive suits and confident manner. This visibility, which stood in stark contrast to the approach of bosses like Carlo Gambino, was a source of unease for more cautious traditionalists. Joseph, a product of that older school, was widely thought to be among those who privately worried about the attention Gotti invited. Nevertheless, he worked diligently to translate the new boss's instructions into concrete actions, ensuring that captains paid their tributes, smoothing over conflicts between factions, and trying to maintain steady income from the family's many rackets. The stability Gotti sought was abruptly shaken in April 1986. On a spring afternoon in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, underboss Frank DeSicco was killed when a bomb exploded beneath his car. The attack, which also seriously injured another Gambino associate, was widely understood by law enforcement as retaliation, likely from rival organized crime figures, for Castallano's murder. In one stroke, Gotti lost his second in command and a key link to Delacroce's legacy. Inside the family, the killing reinforced a hard lesson. Leadership changes did not occur in isolation. They triggered ripples of resentment and retribution across the broader landscape of organized crime. In the aftermath of DeSicco's death, Gotti moved to fill the vacuum swiftly. It was in this context, according to later FBI and prosecutorial documents, that Joseph was elevated to the position of underboss. The choice made strategic sense. He was older, respected across multiple generations of Gambino members, and critically, he embodied the kind of steadiness that Gotti, for all his charisma, did not. As underboss, Joseph became formally, not just informally, second in command, a role that carried both significant influence and tremendous legal risk. Under the logic of RICO, he could now be held criminally responsible for a wide array of acts committed in furtherance of the family's business, even if he was far removed from the street-level details. From the state's perspective, this promotion placed a long-watched figure squarely in their sights. Within months, internal FBI memoranda and organized crime strike force reports began referring to Gotti and Armone in the same breath as they laid out investigative priorities. Agents redoubled efforts to map Joseph's daily routines, identifying the restaurants, clubs, and offices he frequented, the men he met, and the subjects, so far as they could decipher them, of his conversations. Some of these meetings involved straightforward underworld business, disputes over territory, complaints about late payments, logistical questions about collections. Others touched on broader strategic concerns: how to respond to arrests in other families, how to interpret legislative changes, how to handle the growing possibility that someone within their ranks might break the code of silence and cooperate with authorities. Outside these inner circles, the social environment of the mid-1980s was also shaping the struggle between organized crime and the law. The federal government's broader war on drugs had ramped up, leading to harsher sentences, expanded funding for enforcement, and more incentives for defendants to become informants in exchange for reduced punishment. Communities in New York and other cities were grappling with the rise of crack cocaine and escalating concerns about crime, unemployment, and decaying public services. Politicians and media outlets increasingly pointed to organized crime as part of a larger tapestry of forces undermining urban life. While heroin trafficking would not play the same defining role in Joseph's later legal troubles as it had in his earlier conviction, the public anger over narcotics created a climate in which there was little sympathy for those portrayed as leaders of criminal enterprises. Within the Gambino family's territories, economic pressures and opportunities continued to fuel racketeering. Construction booms in some parts of the city offered chances to extract money through corrupt subcontracting and manipulated bidding processes. The family's influence in certain unions remained a powerful lever, giving them the ability to slow or halt work through labor disruptions if contractors did not agree to their terms. Trucking and waste disposal, sectors in which the family had long had a presence, remained vulnerable to extortion. When business owners capitulated, they often passed costs on to customers or cut corners in ways that affected safety and service. When they resisted, they risked vandalism, mysterious regulatory problems, or other forms of pressure. As underboss, Joseph was not the one making every threat or collecting every envelope, but investigators believed he played a central role in sustaining and coordinating the systems that made such exploitation possible. To build cases that could hold men at that level accountable, law enforcement needed more than wiretaps and surveillance photographs. They needed insiders willing to testify. The Witness Security Program, created 2 decades earlier but greatly expanded in the 1970s and 1980s, offered such insiders new identities, financial support, and protection in exchange for detailed, sworn accounts of criminal enterprises. Over time, a trickle of lower-level associates, and even some made members, agreed to cooperate in cases against various families. While none of the most prominent witnesses of the era had yet turned specifically against Gotti and Joseph, by the mid-1980s, the possibility that someone could do so was an ever-present concern. Conversations recorded on FBI bugs at the rave night and other locations during this period are laced with worries about rats, the derogatory term for informants, and about how to detect and deter them. Against this backdrop, federal prosecutors in New York intensified their efforts to apply RICO to the Gambino family specifically. Grand juries heard extended testimony from agents and cooperating witnesses about the family's infiltration of unions, its control of certain trucking routes, and its involvement in illegal gambling and extortion. While individual indictments were still being assembled, the broad outlines of the case were already visible in internal documents. At their center stood the new triumvirate: John Gotti as boss, Joseph Armone as underboss, and an inner circle of captains and advisors who, together, formed what prosecutors would later label the administration of the Gambino crime family. For Joseph, who had once experienced the power of federal narcotics laws firsthand, the gathering legal storm must have carried a grim sense of déjà vu. He had survived one major case, done his time, and risen higher upon his return. Now, as he moved through Manhattan streets increasingly watched by unmarked cars and cameras, he faced an even more expansive legal toolset aimed squarely at men in his position. The traits that had served him so well, discretion, patience, a steady presence in a disorderly world, would again be tested against the persistence and evolving strategies of the state. And this time, the confrontation would unfold under an unprecedented glare, as the rise of John Gotti and his inner circle transformed the struggle between the Gambino family and law enforcement into one of the most closely followed legal sagas of its generation. In the second half of the 1980s, the public image of the Gambino crime family was dominated by the unmistakable figure of John Gotti. Television cameras lingered outside the Rave Night social club in Little Italy, catching grainy glimpses of the man newspapers were calling the Dapper Don. Crowds gathered on the sidewalk to watch him arrive and depart in tailored suits, smiling, laughing, chain-smoking, as if the stakes of the life he led were no heavier than those of a neighborhood card game. Inside, however, beneath the noise of conversation and the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke, a different reality was unfolding, one that revolved around the quiet, methodical work of men like Joseph Armone, and the equally methodical efforts of federal agents and prosecutors determined to hold them accountable. By 1986 and 1987, Joseph's elevation to underboss had placed him squarely at the center of the Gambino administration. While Gotti drew the cameras, it was Joseph who, in many respects, represented continuity with an older era. He was in his late 60s, a survivor of the Mangano, Anastasia, and Gambino years. He had done a long federal prison term without cooperating. He knew the rules, the personalities, and the patterns of pressure that had shaped his world for half a century. Within the family, his reputation for reliability and discretion made him a natural choice to coordinate the flow of money from captains to the top, to mediate disputes, and to help translate Gotti's sometimes impulsive decisions into practical instructions that crews could carry out. For law enforcement, the combination of Gotti's charisma and Joseph's steadiness was both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge lay in the fact that the Gambino leadership had decades of experience evading prosecution, and that they operated within a culture that harshly punished anyone who broke the code of silence. The opportunity derived from the very public way in which Gotti conducted himself. His nightly appearances at the rave night created predictable patterns. The men who came to see him could be photographed and followed. The places they went when they left Mulberry Street could be mapped. Using these patterns as a guide, the FBI and federal prosecutors in Manhattan and Brooklyn intensified a campaign that had been gathering momentum since the mid-1970s. The systematic use of electronic surveillance, informants, and financial analysis to build comprehensive RICO cases against the leadership of the mafia's most powerful families. The rave night itself became a focal point of these efforts. Over time, agents with judicial authorization managed to place listening devices not only in the club, but in an upstairs apartment that Gotti and his closest associates used for especially sensitive conversations. These operations required painstaking planning, identifying when the premises would be empty, entering and exiting undetected, and concealing devices in ways that would survive the frequent sweeps conducted by the family's own counter-surveillance specialists. The resulting recordings, later transcribed and introduced as evidence in various trials, captured a wide range of talk. Complaints about money, commentary on other families, grumbling about lawyers, speculations on who might be informing. They also, at moments, shed light on Joseph's role as underboss. On certain tapes, his voice emerges as measured and controlled. He is heard discussing the need to keep payments regular, to calm heated tempers, to ensure that disputes among captains do not escalate beyond repair. Sometimes he is deferential to Gotti, acknowledging the boss's ultimate authority. At other times, he speaks with the assurance of someone who knows he brings something indispensable to the table, decades of experience, and a memory of what had happened to those who let personal ambition destabilize the organization. Agents and prosecutors listening to these tapes would later argue that they showed not a man on the margins but a full participant in the administration of a racketeering enterprise. Beyond the rave night, investigators also traced Joseph's connections to other long-standing Gambino interests. One of the most significant involved the west side of Manhattan, where, since the 1970s, the Gambinos had cultivated ties with a violent Irish-American group known as the Westies. Through a series of meetings and understandings, the Westies had agreed to align themselves with the Gambino family, paying tribute from their own criminal activities along 11th Avenue and in Hell's Kitchen in exchange for support and guidance. When members of the Westies were later prosecuted in federal court, some chose to cooperate with the government. Their testimony, together with documentary evidence, painted a picture of regular contact between Westies leaders and Gambino figures, including Joseph and Gotti, on matters such as dividing territories, settling disputes, and coordinating extortion of bars and businesses. For prosecutors, this alliance was a key piece of the broader puzzle. It showed that the Gambino administration, under Gotti and Armone, was not merely tolerating independent criminals in its orbit, but organizing and profiting from their activities. Testimony from repentant Westies described meetings in which Gambino leaders set terms, what percentage of certain rackets would flow upward, what conduct was acceptable, and when actions had to be cleared with higher-ups. While Joseph was not described as the loudest voice in those sessions, he was repeatedly named as an authoritative presence, someone whose assent gave decisions weight and whose disapproval carried consequences. At the same time, federal investigators in New York were gathering evidence in more traditional areas of mob influence: illegal gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and extortion. They traced payments from bookmakers and Shylock operations in Queens and Brooklyn to higher-ups, followed the paper trails of shell companies in construction and trucking, and interviewed business owners who had paid for labor peace, or insurance, against trouble. Some of these business owners, understandably fearful, spoke only under promises of anonymity or after being assured of protection. Others, having already been dragged into bankruptcy or criminal liability by their entanglements with the family, were more openly angry, describing how they had been pressured into deals that left them with few good options. As the evidence accumulated, grand juries in the southern and eastern districts of New York heard extended testimony from agents, accountants, and cooperating witnesses. Prosecutors sketched for jurors the outlines of what they alleged was a continuing criminal enterprise headquartered in the Gambino administration, with Gotti as boss and Joseph as underboss. Their theory was that these men, along with a circle of trusted captains and advisors, oversaw and profited from a constellation of illegal activities that harmed workers, businesses, and communities across the city and beyond. It was under this theory that they crafted the indictments that would, for the second time in Joseph's life, pull him from the streets into the stark light of a federal courtroom. In early 1987, a federal grand jury returned a sweeping RICO indictment that named Joseph as a central defendant. The charges encompassed racketeering, conspiracy, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. The indictment cited his formal role as underboss and alleged that he supervised and benefited from the criminal activities of subordinate members and associates. When news of the charges became public, it was clear that prosecutors saw this not as a case against a single crew, but as a direct strike at the highest echelon of the Gambino family. In the days immediately following the indictment, Joseph did not present himself to authorities. Instead, he disappeared from his usual haunts. For federal agents who had spent years watching his movements, this was unsurprising. Facing the prospect of a major RICO trial and the possibility of a lengthy sentence, he chose to go into hiding. The search that followed drew on the full range of tools the FBI had developed in its campaign against organized crime: informants, telephone records, surveillance of known associates, and cooperation with other law enforcement agencies. According to contemporaneous press accounts and later court testimony, the manhunt ended at Kennedy International Airport in Queens. Acting on a tip, agents located Joseph as he prepared to board a flight under an assumed name. Reports described him as dressed inconspicuously, carrying cash and identification documents reflecting an alias. He did not resist arrest. In fact, some accounts quoted him as making a wry remark to the agents, a final gesture of the streetwise persona he had cultivated over decades. Whatever he said, his attempt to evade arrest had failed. He was transported into federal custody to face the charges laid out in the indictment. In the run-up to trial, Joseph's lawyers fought on multiple fronts. They challenged the admissibility of certain wiretap recordings, arguing that the government's electronic surveillance had been overly broad or improperly authorized. They questioned the reliability of cooperating witnesses, many of whom were themselves convicted criminals seeking lighter sentences. They argued that the government's use of the RICO statute was so expansive as to unfairly criminalize ordinary associations and conversations. And they sought, where possible, to separate Joseph's fate from that of his more notorious co-defendants, emphasizing his age and arguing that the prosecution was reading sinister meaning into routine social interactions among Italian-American men. Prosecutors, for their part, framed the case as a necessary response to long-term exploitation. In pretrial filings and opening statements, they described the Gambino family as a sophisticated organization that extracted money from businesses through fear, manipulated unions to its advantage, and ran illegal gambling operations that pushed vulnerable individuals into debilitating debt. They portrayed Joseph as a leader who, far from being a peripheral figure, had risen to oversee key aspects of this system. His earlier narcotics conviction, while not itself the subject of the charges, underscored, in the government's view, the continuity of his involvement in serious criminal activity over many years. When the trial began, in a federal courtroom crowded with journalists and spectators, Joseph cut a very different figure from the one dominating the front pages. Where Gotti had become almost a media personality, Joseph appeared as a reserved, aging man in conservative suits, sitting silently at the defense table, occasionally conferring with his attorneys. The prosecution's case unfolded over weeks. Jurors heard recordings from the rave night and other locations in which they were told they would hear the coded language of extortion and illegal gambling. They saw charts mapping the alleged structure of the Gambino family, with Joseph's name just below Gotti's. They listened to business owners and former associates describe payments made, threats received, and the unwritten rules of a system in which refusal to cooperate could lead to damaged property, indefinite labor troubles, or worse. The defense sought to undermine each component of this narrative. They cross-examined informants mercilessly, highlighting their criminal records, their plea agreements, and any inconsistencies in their statements. They argued that the structure of the Gambino family was far less formal and centralized than the government claimed, and that Joseph, while certainly acquainted with many of the people testifying, could not justly be held responsible for every act they had committed over the years. They suggested that some conversations captured on tape were mere boasting or posturing, not concrete plans. They emphasized the absence of direct evidence tying Joseph personally to explicit threats or acts of intimidation. Yet the legal landscape in which this trial unfolded was very different from that of Joseph's first major confrontation with the federal system in the early 1960s. By the late 1980s, judges and appellate courts had largely endorsed the broad use of RICO in organized crime cases. Jurors were instructed that they could find a defendant guilty of racketeering if they concluded that he had participated in the affairs of an enterprise through a pattern of criminal activity, even if he had not personally carried out every underlying act. For a man in the formal position of underboss, this principle cut sharply. It meant that the jury's assessment of his guilt or innocence would turn less on whether he had been physically present at a particular shakedown, and more on whether they believed he had knowingly helped direct and sustain the system in which such shakedowns occurred. After weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Joseph was found guilty on the core racketeering and related charges. The decision was a significant victory for the prosecution. It demonstrated that, even in the face of aggressive defense tactics and the mystique that still clung to figures like Gotti and his inner circle, a jury could be persuaded by the cumulative weight of tapes, documents, and witness accounts. For Joseph, now in his early 70s, the verdict meant that he would again be facing a substantial period of incarceration. At sentencing, the judge spoke to the gravity of the offenses. Drawing on the trial record, he described the harm inflicted by the Gambino family's activities. Businesses forced to choose between capitulating to extortion or risking economic ruin. Workers whose union dues were diverted from their intended purposes. Communities where illegal gambling and loan sharking fostered cycles of addiction and desperation. He noted Joseph's leadership role and prior narcotics conviction. The resulting sentence was stiff, a federal prison term measured in double digits of years, along with a substantial financial penalty. Observers in the courtroom understood that, given Joseph's age, this was effectively a life-shaping punishment. The contrast with Gotti's situation was striking. While Gotti had, by this point, already beaten multiple cases, a pattern that would earn him the nickname, the Teflon Don, his underboss now faced the prospect of spending much of the rest of his life in federal custody. For some in law enforcement, Joseph's conviction was a sign that persistence was beginning to pay off. The legal tools and investigative techniques honed over decades could finally pierce the armor of leadership-level mob figures, even if not yet in every case. For members of the Gambino family, the sentence was a reminder of the risks attached to holding high office in a world under siege from the state. Joseph entered the federal prison system for the second time as a much older man than when he had first passed through its gates in the 1960s. The adjustment was, in many ways, more severe. He was no longer in the middle of his working life but approaching its end. His health, while not yet in the steep decline that would mark his final years, required more careful monitoring. He carried with him the knowledge that the landscape outside was changing rapidly, that Gotti remained a high-profile target for prosecutors, that RICO cases were continuing to erode the power of other families, that some former associates in various organizations had begun to cooperate with authorities at higher levels than ever before. Inside, he followed a path familiar to many older organized crime figures, maintaining contact with family through letters and visits, accepting the routines of count times and institutional schedules, and quietly sustaining ties to the world he had left behind. Within the culture of the mafia, his refusal to cooperate with the government, once again, reinforced his reputation for loyalty. Yet outside the prison walls, the forces he had devoted his life to sustaining were under unprecedented strain. The very tapes and informant testimonies that had helped secure his conviction would soon, in even more dramatic form, be turned against the man he had served as underboss. And in that final confrontation between the state and John Gotti, Joseph's story, his ascent, his choices, his convictions, would form an essential part of the background that prosecutors used to argue that the era of the old-line Gambino leadership was coming to an end. When the courtroom doors closed behind him and the chains were removed, Joseph entered a familiar but harsher world. The federal judge had given him a 15-year sentence and a substantial fine, a punishment calibrated to reflect both the breadth of the racketeering case and his role as underboss in the Gambino family. He was in his early 70s now, far older than he had been during his first long stretch in federal custody in the 1960s. The years between had brought him status, money, and influence on the street, but in the federal system they brought no special privileges. He was processed, assigned a number, and sent into the routines of a medium security prison. Counts, work assignments, meals served at fixed hours, movements regulated by buzzers and locked doors. For an older inmate, the adjustment was physically and psychologically demanding. Prison life was noisy and monotonous, structured around institutional priorities rather than personal preference. Yet for someone of Joseph's background, there were also familiar elements. Other men with organized crime ties were housed in the same or nearby facilities. They formed small circles in the yard or at certain tables in the dining hall, maintaining a semblance of the social hierarchies that had structured their lives outside. Younger prisoners, aware of the reputations attached to certain names, sometimes gravitated toward them, seeking stories or advice. Joseph, by most credible accounts, did not encourage such attention. He kept to a modest routine, preserving the reserved demeanor that had long characterized him. His attorneys moved quickly to appeal his conviction. They challenged the government's use of RICO, arguing that prosecutors had stretched the statute beyond its intended scope by attributing to Joseph responsibility for a wide range of acts that he had not personally committed. They questioned the admission of certain wiretap recordings, contending that the surveillance orders had been overly broad or insufficiently justified. They attacked the credibility of cooperating witnesses, highlighting the sentences they hoped to avoid and the benefits they expected to receive for their testimony. In appellate briefs, they tried to recast Joseph not as a master strategist at the center of a criminal network, but as an aging man whose social connections and past reputation had allowed prosecutors to embroider a story that, in the defense view, went beyond what the evidence truly proved. The U.S. Court of Appeals, however, was not persuaded. In a decision issued toward the end of the 1980s, the judges affirmed the conviction and sentence. They held that the government had introduced sufficient evidence for a reasonable jury to find that Joseph had participated in the affairs of the Gambino enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity. They upheld the use of the surveillance tapes and rejected claims that the trial judge had erred in instructing the jury about conspiracy and enterprise liability under RICO. When Joseph's legal team sought further review, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. With that, the avenues for overturning his conviction were effectively closed. The 15-year sentence stood. Outside the prison walls, John Gotti continued to dominate headlines. In 1986 and 1987, he had already stunned many observers by winning acquittals in two closely watched trials, one in state court involving the shooting of a bar owner, another in federal court involving racketeering allegations tied to the Gambino hierarchy. Newspapers dubbed him the Teflon Don, suggesting that nothing prosecutors brought against him seemed to stick. Television news programs ran footage of him leaving court smiling, surrounded by bodyguards and admirers. To some in the public, this image became a symbol of brazen defiance. To law enforcement professionals, it was a stinging reminder of how difficult it was to translate investigation into conviction when facing well-financed defense teams and defendants schooled in the art of avoiding overt incriminating acts. Joseph saw these developments from a distance, through newspapers, television broadcasts in prison common rooms, and letters from family members. There is no public record of his private reactions, no memoirs or authorized biographies in which he reflected on the spectacle of his former boss striding past reporters, while he himself adjusted to institutional beds and scheduled visits. But the contrast between their situations was impossible to miss. The boss remained free, at least for the moment. The underboss was serving a lengthy sentence with little realistic hope of early release. At the same time, the very system that had sent Joseph back to prison was gathering strength in its campaign against the remaining leadership outside. The FBI and federal prosecutors had learned from their earlier losses. They re-examined how juries had reacted to previous cases, refined the way they presented complex conspiracies, and redoubled efforts to recruit credible cooperating witnesses. One of the most significant sources of testimony came from outside the Gambino family itself. The trial of the Westies, the Irish-American gang from Manhattan's West Side that had long worked under Gambino protection. In that case, federal prosecutors charged several Westies leaders with racketeering, extortion, and other serious offenses. Facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of long sentences, some members agreed to cooperate. In sworn testimony, They described their gang's relationship with the Gambino family in detail, how tribute was paid, how disputes were resolved, how they were expected to clear certain actions with higher-ups. Names like Gotti and Armone surfaced repeatedly. The witnesses spoke of meetings at which Gambino representatives set general guidelines and reacted to specific incidents. While Joseph was already incarcerated by then, the testimony reinforced the government's portrayal of him as a longtime architect of Gambino influence over the West Side, someone who had helped establish and maintain a structure that allowed the family to profit from the Westies' activities. The broader picture that emerged in courts across New York by the late 1980s was of a criminal landscape under sustained pressure. RICO cases targeted not only the Gambinos, but also the Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo families. Major trials chipped away at their control over unions, construction contracts, and traditional rackets. Some high-ranking figures were convicted and imprisoned. Others died, retired, or attempted to recede into the background. Yet the Gambino family, despite the loss of its underboss and the ongoing legal troubles of its boss, continued to function. New lieutenants rose to fill vacated roles. Revenues from illegal gambling, loan sharking, and corrupt business arrangements did not disappear overnight. Within the Gambino hierarchy, Joseph's removal created both a practical gap and a symbolic one. Practically, someone had to take over the duties he had handled, coordinating tributes, overseeing certain crews, participating in strategic discussions. Symbolically, his conviction reinforced the message that the very highest ranks were vulnerable. John Gotti eventually turned to a trusted captain, Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, promoting him into the underboss role that Joseph had once held. Gravano had made his reputation as a hardworking earner and an enforcer, but he also had a pragmatic streak and organizational skill. From law enforcement's point of view, the elevation of a man like Gravano meant that the Gambino administration now consisted of a boss who attracted cameras everywhere he went, and an underboss deeply familiar with the day-to-day mechanics of the family's rackets. For Joseph, following these developments from prison, the reshuffling at the top altered his position in the Gambino story. He was no longer the sitting underboss but a former one, part of the recent past rather than the active present. Nevertheless, his name continued to appear in government narratives about the family. In trials, in congressional hearings, and in press briefings, officials frequently traced the evolution of the Gambinos from Carlo Gambino through Castallano and Gotti, highlighting the roles played by key lieutenants along the way. Joseph's earlier narcotics conviction in the 1960s and his 1980s racketeering conviction formed bookends in a story prosecutors told about a man who, in their view, had been deeply embedded in serious organized crime for much of his adult life. Inside the prison system, Joseph aged. He dealt with the health issues common to men in their 70s: cardiovascular concerns, joint problems, the cumulative toll of decades of stress and cigarettes. The Bureau of Prisons maintained medical facilities for inmates whose conditions required more specialized care, and in time, Joseph would spend stretches in such institutions. These were austere, clinically focused environments, far removed from the social clubs and restaurants that had once defined his daily routines. Fellow inmates and a small number of guards who later spoke to journalists or researchers remembered him as quiet, self-contained, and disciplined about his habits. He read newspapers, kept up with developments in New York, and maintained ties with family through whatever communication channels were available. Meanwhile, beyond the prison gates, the relationship between the FBI and John Gotti entered a new phase. Determined to avoid the missteps that had contributed to earlier acquittals, agents intensified their surveillance of the Rave Night Social Club and its surrounding buildings. They refined their use of hidden microphones, placing bugs not only in the club itself, but in an upstairs apartment and other nearby locations that Gotti used for private conversations. Over time, they amassed a library of recordings that, in their view, demonstrated Gotti's direct involvement in decisions about murders, beatings, extortion schemes, and responses to perceived disloyalty within the family. The content of these tapes would become crucial a few years later, but even before they were played in courtrooms, they influenced how investigators and prosecutors conceptualized the Gambino enterprise. In internal memoranda and draft indictments, they described a hierarchy in which Gotti and Gravano sat at the apex, but in which older figures like Joseph, even from prison, still represented continuity with the past. The narrative was not merely of a new boss arriving out of nowhere, but of a succession in which each layer drew on the experience and networks of those who had come before. In 1990, the long campaign to bring a comprehensive case against Gotti and his administration culminated in a major federal indictment. Returned by a grand jury in Brooklyn, it charged Gotti, Gravano, and consigliere Frank Locascio, among others, with racketeering, multiple killings, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and obstruction of justice. The indictment rested heavily on the Rave Night tapes and on the testimony that prosecutors hoped to elicit from cooperating witnesses. It depicted the Gambino family as a continuing criminal enterprise that had, under Gotti's leadership, directed or sanctioned a range of serious offenses. Joseph's name appeared in this context as well. Contemporary news accounts and court records indicate that he was identified as a former underboss and, in some filings, listed as a co-defendant or unindicted co-conspirator in related racketeering allegations. Because he was already serving a lengthy sentence and his health was deteriorating, any new proceedings against him personally moved slowly. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys had to weigh the practical value of devoting resources to a separate trial against an aging, incarcerated man. In several instances, courts severed his case from that of his more active co-defendants, postponing it indefinitely while the main prosecution against Gotti and his immediate circle went forward. For the prosecutors, however, Joseph's earlier conviction and formal status as underboss remained central to the story they told juries about the Gambino family in the Gotti-era. When the government presented its case in the 1991-1992 trial that would ultimately end Gotti's reign, they did not focus only on the boss and his current underboss. Through charts, testimony, and argument, they sketched a lineage that ran back through Castallano and Carlo Gambino, emphasizing that what they were confronting was not a transient gang but a deeply rooted institution. In that lineage, Joseph stood as a representative of a particular generation, one that had come of age in the Prohibition and Depression eras, had adapted to the post-war boom, and had navigated the expanding legal arsenal of the 1960s and 1970s. The most dramatic turn in the Gotti case came from a source few in the underworld would have predicted a decade earlier: Salvatore Gravano. Facing the weight of the 1990 indictment, aware of the strength of the Rave Night tapes, and increasingly disillusioned by what he perceived as Gotti's self-defeating thirst for publicity and control, Gravano made a decision that would reverberate through every family in New York. In 1991, he agreed to cooperate with the federal government. He entered the witness security program, sat for extended debriefings, and eventually took the stand as the government's star witness against his former boss and colleague. On the witness stand, Gravano provided an insider's account of the Gambino family's inner workings. He described initiation ceremonies, the structure of leadership, the division of labor among captains, and the mechanisms for resolving disputes. He testified about killings, including the murder of Castallano outside Sparks Steak House, and about the decisions that had led to them. He explained the logic behind various extortion schemes and the way money flowed upward through the family. In this sweeping narrative, Joseph appeared periodically, as Castallano's and later Gotti's underboss, as a senior figure consulted on important matters, as someone whose earlier conviction had both removed him from the street and created opportunities for others, like Gravano himself, to rise. For Joseph, still in federal custody and already in declining health, Gravano's testimony would have been a stark breach of the code that had governed his entire adult life. The principle that one did not testify against one's associates had guided his choices in both of his major cases. Now a man who had sat at the same table, held the same office, and sworn the same oaths was not only cooperating, but doing so in a highly public, televised trial. In the culture of organized crime, such cooperation was denounced as treachery. Yet in the eyes of the law, it was a powerful tool, the mechanism by which long opaque criminal structures could finally be laid bare before juries and the public. The societal context in which this drama played out had shifted considerably since Joseph's first encounters with law enforcement in the mid-20th century. By the early 1990s, public tolerance for organized crime had eroded. The glamorized portrayals that had sometimes dominated popular culture were increasingly counterbalanced by investigative journalism and academic work that emphasized the costs, diverted union funds, inflated construction and service prices, neighborhoods where fear and corruption distorted daily life. Politicians campaigned on promises to be tough on crime, and few public figures expressed reservations about the aggressive use of RICO or witness protection deals in mob cases. If anything, the criticism that surfaced was that law enforcement had not moved quickly enough, for long enough, against figures like Gotti and his predecessors. In this environment, Joseph's role in the unfolding story was both central and fatting. Central, because prosecutors and historians alike continued to cite his career as emblematic of a generation of mafia leaders who had shepherded the American Cosa Nostra from its early consolidation through its heyday in the post-war period. Fatting, because his physical presence had been removed from the street and the courtroom. While Gotti stood trial, watched by millions, Joseph underwent medical tests, navigated the small world of prison clinics, and saw his own legal matters pushed to the margins of dockets and calendars. The man who had once slipped quietly past reporters on his way into court now found himself far from the lights, aging in institutions designed not for drama, but for containment. His story was increasingly told not through his own words, but through the voices of others. Prosecutors summarizing his role, former associates invoking his name in testimony, journalists placing him in charts and timelines of the Gambino family's evolution. In the early 1990s, as the government closed in on a conviction that would finally send John Gotti to prison, Joseph's life was entering its final chapter, one in which his body, worn down by years of stress and confinement, would soon give way even as the legal and historical reckoning with the world he had helped sustain continued to unfold without him. By the time the government finally put John Gotti on trial in Brooklyn in late 1991 and early 1992, Joseph Armone's world had contracted to the narrow corridors and ward rooms of the federal prison system. The man who had spent decades moving between smoky social clubs, back office meetings, and construction site payoffs was now an aging inmate with a long record and a failing body. His name still appeared regularly in the press, but not as a central actor. Instead, he was described as former underboss, a figure whose convictions and long silence helped frame the story prosecutors were now telling about the Gambino crime family in the Gotti-era. Gotti's racketeering trial, held in the Eastern District of New York, was built on tools that had matured over the very decades Joseph had spent in and around organized crime. The RICO statute, extensive electronic surveillance, and high-level insider cooperation. The core of the government's case consisted of hundreds of hours of recordings captured by FBI microphones planted in the Rave Night Social Club and an upstairs apartment where Gotti and his inner circle believed they could speak freely. In those tapes, jurors heard discussions about murders, assaults, extortion schemes, and strategic decisions about the family's operations. They also heard candid, often profane assessments of other mob figures and commentary on past episodes in the Gambino story. Among the voices identified on some of those recordings was that of Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, who by 1991 had broken with the organization and agreed to testify for the government. On the stand, Gravano laid out his version of the family's internal workings, from initiation rituals to murder plots. He described how power and responsibility had shifted over time, noting that before he became underboss, he had served under and alongside men such as Joseph, who had occupied that same office. Gravano's narrative, while focused overwhelmingly on Gotti and on his own role in numerous crimes, situated Joseph as one of the key architects of the Gambino hierarchy in the years leading up to Gotti's rise. For prosecutors, this historical context mattered. They wanted jurors to see Gotti not as a solitary outlaw, but as the latest leader of a long-lived, structured enterprise that had roots stretching back to the Castallano War and the post-prohibition reorganization of New York's underworld. Joseph's earlier narcotics conviction in the late 1950s and his 1980s racketeering conviction were repeatedly cited in court filings and press briefings as evidence of the continuity of that enterprise. Even in absence, he functioned as a key reference point. The underboss who had gone to prison for narcotics returned to rise again under Castallano and Gotti, then gone back to prison under the weight of the very RICO law now being used against his successors. While these proceedings played out in New York, Joseph's circumstances inside the federal system were deteriorating. Years of confinement, age, and the stresses of his lifestyle had taken a toll on his health. Inmates of his generation commonly suffered from heart disease, respiratory ailments, and other chronic conditions. The Bureau of Prisons had, by this time, developed a network of medical facilities to treat prisoners whose needs exceeded what ordinary institutions could provide. One of the most prominent was the Federal Medical Center at Springfield, Missouri, a secure hospital complex where inmates from around the country were sent for long-term treatment. It was to Springfield that Joseph was eventually transferred. The date of the transfer appears in Bureau of Prisons records but did not make headlines. It was one of countless bureaucratic movements in a system that, by design, kept individuals out of the public eye. For Joseph, however, the relocation marked a final stage in his life. The environment there was different from a standard prison, more clinical, more regimented around medical appointments and treatments, but still governed by the same strictures of custody. Patients wore prison clothing, moved under escort, and were subject to the usual counts and controls. The sense of separation from the outside world, already strong in a regular institution, could feel nearly absolute in a medical center located hundreds of miles from the dense urban neighborhoods where many of its inmates had lived their entire lives. From Springfield, Joseph would have learned about developments in New York the way other long-term inmates did, through newspapers, televised news in common rooms, letters, and occasional visits from family or attorneys. He would have seen headlines about Gotti's trial, read excerpts from Gravano's testimony, and noted the familiar names and places that appeared in coverage. Reporters and commentators routinely mentioned him when tracing how the Gambino family had evolved into its current form. Articles summarized his career in a few sentences. Born in 1917, early involvement in the family, a major narcotics conviction in the late 1950s, release and re-emergence as a captain, promotion to underboss under Gotti, conviction on racketeering charges in 1988, and now an aging prisoner, far from New York in declining health. The record does not contain Joseph's private reactions to these portrayals. He did not grant interviews or publish memoirs. In that sense, he remained consistent with the code he had lived by, avoiding public comment, refusing to speak to authorities about his associates, and leaving it to others, prosecutors, journalists, former colleagues turned witnesses, to tell the story of his world. What is clear is that his legal situation had reached a kind of stasis. His conviction and sentence had been affirmed on appeal. Any additional charges that might have been brought against him in connection with the Gotti case or related investigations were effectively mooted by his age, infirmity, and the length of time he was already serving. The government's focus had shifted decisively to the men still active on the street. On February 22, 1992, as the Gotti trial was still underway in Brooklyn, the Bureau of Prisons announced that Joseph had died at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield. He was 74 years old. The official statement described his death as resulting from natural causes associated with a long illness. There was no dramatic final scene, no televised transport, no last-minute appeals. His passing occurred, as so many prison deaths do, away from the cameras, attended primarily by medical staff and a handful of other inmates. News of his death nonetheless filtered quickly back to New York. The Associated Press and local outlets ran brief notices. Joseph Armone, former Gambino underboss, dies in federal custody, or variations on that theme. Obituaries summarized his career in organized crime and noted that he had been serving a 15-year sentence for racketeering and extortion at the time of his death. Some reports mentioned his earlier narcotics conviction, highlighting the span of his involvement in serious criminal enterprises. Law enforcement officials quoted in these pieces tended to focus on his role as part of a generation of leaders who had, in their view, done significant damage to the city through systematic exploitation of workers, businesses, and vulnerable individuals. Within the Gambino family, Joseph's death did not trigger a visible succession crisis. The leadership had already adjusted to his absence when he was sent back to prison in the late 1980s. Salvatore Gravano had taken over the underboss role, and after Gravano's cooperation agreement in 1991, the family again reshuffled its internal structure to adapt. But for older members and associates who had known Joseph personally, men who had come up under the Mangano, Anastasia, or early Gambino regimes, his passing marked the end of a particular thread of continuity. He had been a link to the era when the modern five families were first formalized, when prohibition had just ended and narcotics, illegal gambling, and labor racketeering were beginning to coalesce into the pillars of a national criminal enterprise. Joseph's remains were eventually returned to New York. Public records and cemetery registries indicate that he was interred at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, a burial ground that holds the graves of numerous figures from New York's organized crime history, as well as many ordinary Italian-American families. Any funeral or memorial service that followed was a private affair. In light of his status as a convicted racketeer and former underboss, and the intense law enforcement scrutiny still focused on the Gambino family, it is unlikely that any gathering around his burial was large or ostentatious. If longtime associates came to pay respects, they did so without drawing attention, consistent with the low-profile approach that had characterized much of Joseph's own style. 2 months after Joseph's death, on April 2, 1992, the jury in John Gotti's trial returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Along with Gotti, consigliere Frank Locascio was also convicted. The charges included racketeering, multiple murders, illegal gambling, and obstruction of justice. In June, the judge sentenced Gotti to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Television cameras recorded the scenes outside the courthouse. Commentators spoke of a final blow against the Gambino family's leadership. In the narratives constructed around that moment, Joseph was often framed as a precursor, the underboss who had gone down first, whose conviction had foreshadowed the state's eventual ability to convict the boss himself. The pairing of these events, the quiet death of Joseph in a medical facility and the spectacular conviction of Gotti in a Brooklyn courtroom, symbolized, for many observers, the end of an era. The generation of leaders who had guided the Gambino family through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s was gone. Carlo Gambino had died in 1976 of heart disease. Paul Castallano had been murdered in 1985. Frank DeSicco had been killed by a bomb in 1986. Now Joseph was dead in prison, and Gotti was beginning his own life sentence in a federal facility. The roster of names associated with the family's most powerful years was increasingly found not in social club ledgers, but in Bureau of Prisons records and obituary pages. Yet the effects of their choices did not vanish with them. The systems they had helped build, in gambling, loan sharking, union corruption, and business extortion, had left lasting scars. Some victims had gone bankrupt or lost their livelihoods. Some legitimate union reformers who had tried to push back against mob influence in locals tied to the Gambinos had faced harassment and professional retaliation. Construction projects and service contracts, rigged over years to favor companies connected to organized crime, had distorted markets and likely raised costs for taxpayers and consumers. In that sense, Joseph's life could not be neatly separated into a criminal sphere and a normal sphere. The two had been intertwined through the mechanisms of racketeering he helped administer. As researchers and journalists in the 1990s and 2000s dug into the archives of organized crime cases, Joseph's name continued to appear in books, academic articles, and documentaries. Some authors focused on his early role in international narcotics trafficking, emphasizing how the pipelines established in the 1950s and 1960s had fueled addiction and social turmoil. Others highlighted his later status as underboss, using his trajectory to illustrate how the Gambino family had tried to balance traditional street rackets with more sophisticated business infiltrations. Still others treated him as a case study in the persistence of organized crime, a man who, despite prison terms and increased law enforcement attention, returned repeatedly to the same world, rising each time to positions of greater authority until the law finally confined him for the remainder of his life. Within these accounts, there was little romanticism. The mythologizing language that had sometimes surrounded stories of men of honor in earlier decades gave way to a more sober assessment of harm. Joseph's periods of influence were correlated with surges in illegal gambling and loan sharking in particular neighborhoods, with corruption scandals in specific unions, and with episodes of violence or intimidation directed at those who refused to submit to extortion. Legal scholars used his cases to trace the development of federal racketeering law, noting how the government's initial struggle to prosecute complex conspiracies had led to innovations in statutes and investigative tactics. Sociologists examined his life course to understand how young men from immigrant communities, faced with limited economic opportunities and persistent discrimination, could be drawn into criminal organizations that presented themselves as sources of protection and advancement, only to find that leaving that world was extraordinarily difficult once deeply enmeshed. In prison cemeteries and archival files, Joseph's story might have seemed to come to a quiet end in 1992. But in New York courtrooms, council chambers, and neighborhoods, the consequences of the battles in which he had played a part continued to shape policy and public debate. City and state officials pushed reforms aimed at breaking organized crime's grip on key sectors, stricter oversight of unions and benefit funds, more transparent bidding processes for public contracts, and specialized investigative units tasked with monitoring potential infiltration of new industries. At the federal level, the success of RICO in cases against figures like Joseph and Gotti encouraged prosecutors to deploy the law in other contexts as well, sometimes controversially, against alleged corruption and complex fraud schemes not traditionally associated with the mafia. For the shrinking circle of older Gambino associates who had known Joseph personally and outlived him, his memory likely remained bound up more with personal interactions, conversations in clubs, shared meals, favors given or withheld, than with the sweeping legal and historical narratives constructed after the fact. But for the broader public, his name became part of a pattern, a shorthand reference in stories about how a particular strain of organized crime had taken root, adapted, and under sustained pressure, began to recede from its once dominant position. By the late 1990s, as new forms of criminality commanded attention, international drug cartels, white-collar scandals, emerging cybercrime, the era in which Joseph had been most active started to feel more distant. Yet the legal doctrines, investigative methods, and institutional memories forged in the fight against men of his generation remained foundational. Every time a prosecutor invoked RICO in a complex case, every time an FBI team planned a covert listening operation against a tightly insulated group, they were drawing, whether consciously or not, on lessons first hard-won in cases against the Gambino organization and its leaders. In that sense, Joseph's life left a trace far beyond his personal biography. He helped shape the arc of the very institutions that pursued him. The evolution of federal law enforcement, the development of witness protection programs, the jurisprudence around conspiracy and enterprise liability, all bore marks of the long struggle between organized crime figures like him and the state. His death in a Missouri medical center did not end that story. It merely closed one human chapter in a larger, ongoing effort to reckon with the shadow economies and informal power structures that had grown up alongside official ones in 20th century America. Years after Joseph Armone's death, the New York streets that had shaped his life looked, on the surface, very different. The waterfront piers where mob-connected stevedores once moved cargo under the eye of corrupt union bosses had been converted in places to parks and luxury developments. The Hell's Kitchen bars where the Westies had collected payments under Gambino supervision were gentrifying, their previous history invisible behind new facades. Even Mulberry Street, home to the Rave Night Social Club, had shifted from being a nerve center of Italian-American organized crime to a largely symbolic stop on tourist walks through Little Italy. Yet beneath the changed storefronts and fresh coats of paint, the traces of the world Joseph inhabited lingered in court records, in union archives, and in the memories of those who had watched the long conflict between organized crime and the state. In that conflict, Joseph's career formed a through line stretching from the mid-20th century into the early 1990s. He came of age when the modern structure of the mafia was still being consolidated, when bosses like Vincent Mangan and Albert Anastasia were struggling for control of rackets born out of Prohibition and Depression-era scarcity. He later operated under Carlo Gambino, whose quiet consolidation of power defined an era, then under Paul Castallano, whose emphasis on business infiltrations drew both profit and resentment, and finally as underboss to John Gotti, the most publicly visible mob leader of his generation. Through each chapter, Joseph adapted to shifting leadership and legal pressures, but the underlying work remained largely the same: managing illegal gambling and high-interest loans, coordinating extortion disguised as labor peace or protection, and helping to maintain the discipline and secrecy that kept the organization functioning. For historians and criminologists looking back, his life offers a kind of X-ray view of how the American mafia embedded itself in the economic and social fabric of mid-century cities. Joseph's early years illustrate how discrimination and limited opportunity in immigrant neighborhoods created conditions in which criminal groups could present themselves as parallel institutions, offering loans when banks turned people away, arranging jobs when mainstream employers discriminated, and providing a sense of protection in communities that did not trust the police. Over time, however, the cost of accepting those services became clear: dependence, inflated fees enforced through intimidation, and a climate in which challenging exploitation could be dangerous. His first major federal conviction, in a narcotics case born of 1950s investigations into heroin pipelines, shows how quickly local rackets could connect to global patterns. The Bureau of Narcotics traced heroin shipments from the Middle East and Europe into American cities, uncovering networks in which Italian and Sicilian traffickers worked with U.S. crime families. Joseph and his older brother Stephen appeared in those investigations as intermediaries, not the chemists in distant laboratories, not the street-level dealers in American neighborhoods, but figures in the middle, coordinating money, logistics, and access. The social costs of that trade, addiction, family breakdown, community destabilization, fell hardest on the same kinds of working-class neighborhoods where Joseph had grown up. His conviction in that period underscored that the reach of organized crime extended far beyond harmless-sounding card games and neighborhood clubs. His later ascent to underboss under Gotti revealed another dimension of organized crime's impact: its infiltration of legitimate industries and institutions. Through testimony, wiretaps, and financial records assembled in the 1970s and 1980s, investigators documented the Gambino family's control over certain trucking routes, its manipulation of construction contracts, and its influence in specific union locals. Companies connected to or controlled by the family secured contracts, not always because they offered the best price or quality, but because rival bidders understood that the playing field was not level. Union funds meant to support workers' pensions or health benefits were sometimes siphoned off through corrupt schemes. These practices harmed not only those directly extorted, but also taxpayers and consumers who bore the downstream costs of inflated contracts and degraded services. In these spheres, Joseph rarely appeared as the man on the loading dock or the enforcer at a meeting. Instead, law enforcement files and trial evidence cast him as a coordinator, someone who ensured that captains understood the expectations, that money moved upward reliably, and that serious disputes were settled internally before they drew outside attention. That organizational role made him central to prosecutors' use of the RICO statute. Under RICO, leadership figures could be held liable not only for acts they carried out personally, but for their participation in directing an enterprise engaged in a pattern of serious crimes. When a federal jury convicted Joseph on racketeering charges in 1988, they were accepting the argument that his place in the hierarchy made him accountable for the system he helped manage. The legal legacy of his case is evident in the evolution of RICO itself. In the early years after the law's passage in 1970, courts wrestled with questions about how broadly it could be applied, how to define an enterprise, and how to balance its reach with civil liberties. Cases like Joseph's tested those boundaries. Appellate decisions upholding his conviction signaled that courts were prepared to endorse an expansive view of RICO in organized crime cases, one that recognized crime families as enterprises and allowed prosecutors to present decades of coordinated activity as part of a single, coherent pattern. This approach, honed in the 1980s, would later be applied in other contexts, from complex fraud schemes to public corruption, making Joseph's case part of a wider transformation in American criminal law. The institutional response to the harms associated with his world extended beyond prosecution. In the late 1980s and 1990s, federal and state authorities moved to reform or monitor unions and industries that had long been vulnerable to mob influence. Court-appointed trustees were installed in some locals to clean up leadership and finances. Oversight boards were established to scrutinize contracts in construction, trucking, and sanitation. New rules sought to increase transparency in bidding processes and limit the ability of any single firm or group to dominate a market through intimidation rather than competition. These reforms were uneven and contested, but they reflected a growing recognition that dismantling the structures Joseph and his contemporaries had built required not just arrests, but sustained institutional change. At the same time, the social and cultural understanding of figures like Joseph shifted. Earlier decades had seen a wave of films and novels that, intentionally or not, contributed to a certain romanticization of the mafia, portraying its members as bound by a strict code of loyalty and honor, set apart from more chaotic forms of crime. As more information emerged from court cases, witness testimony, and investigative reporting, those narratives were increasingly challenged. Accounts from former insiders like Joseph Valachi in the 1960s and Salvatore Gravano in the 1990s revealed an environment shaped as much by fear, self-interest, and internal betrayal as by any idealized sense of honor. They described how codes were invoked selectively and broken when expedient, and how the supposed protection offered to communities often came at the price of vulnerability to exploitation. In that revised picture, Joseph appears less as a romantic anti-hero and more as a skilled manager of systems that generated real suffering. The loan sharking operations that provided quick cash to gamblers or struggling business owners frequently trapped borrowers in cycles of debt. The illegal gambling rings that offered an evening's diversion for some left others chasing losses they could not afford. The corruption of unions and business associations undermined the very mechanisms ordinary people relied on to secure fair wages and safe working conditions. His personal loyalty to his brother, to his bosses, to the organization that had shaped his life, did not translate into loyalty to the broader communities whose labor and vulnerabilities supported his world's profits. Yet understanding his life also requires recognizing the constraints and pressures that helped channel his choices. He was born into an immigrant family in an era when Italian Americans faced pervasive discrimination in housing, employment, and public life. Policing in his youth was often heavy-handed and in many neighborhoods distrusted. The early mafia figures he encountered presented themselves as providers of alternative forms of security and opportunity, filling gaps left by mainstream institutions. For young men in those streets, the boundary between legitimate hustle and organized criminality could blur. Working on the docks might mean dealing with a union local influenced by mob figures. Running errands for older men at a social club might be framed as paying dues in a tight-knit community. None of this absolves him of responsibility for the decisions he made, or for the harms that flowed from his actions, but it does situate those decisions within broader patterns of American social history. His trajectory, and that of many of his peers, illustrates how structural inequality, cultural marginalization, and institutional failure can create openings for criminal organizations to present themselves as both protectors and predators. It also shows how, over time, the state adapted, building new legal tools and enforcement strategies to confront forms of organized crime that had originally grown in the spaces left unguarded by earlier laws and institutions. The decline of the traditional mafia in New York in the 1990s and 2000s, the shrinking of membership rolls, the loss of control over certain unions and industries, the fragmentation of once centralized families, is often attributed to a combination of successful prosecutions, demographic change, and evolving criminal opportunities. Younger generations in Italian-American communities had greater access to education and legitimate employment. They were less likely to see organized crime as their best or only path to advancement. Law enforcement, drawing on lessons from decades of cases against men like Joseph, had become more adept at infiltrating tightly knit groups, protecting cooperating witnesses, and following money across borders. Competing criminal enterprises, including international drug cartels and financial fraud networks, shifted the landscape of illicit opportunity. Still, organized crime did not disappear. It adapted. Some remnants of the old families continued to operate more quietly in selected rackets. New groups, domestic and transnational, moved into areas once dominated by the mafia or exploited emerging arenas such as cybercrime. The legacies of the Gambino organization and its peers lived on less invisible social clubs and street corners than in the legal doctrines, investigative techniques, and public vigilance that their activities had prompted. Each new generation of law enforcement recruits studied cases like Joseph's as part of their training, learning how earlier investigators had pieced together complex conspiracies from seemingly mundane observations. Who met where? Who collected which payments? How coded phrases on a restaurant phone line mapped onto changes in a company's payroll or a union's leadership. In popular memory, Joseph never became as prominent a figure as Gotti or Carlo Gambino. He appeared more often in footnotes and charts than on front pages, mentioned in passing as former underboss or Gotti lieutenant. Yet that relative anonymity, even at the height of his power, is itself revealing. It reflects the way his world was structured. Public flamboyance at the very top in the late Gotti years, but a preference among seasoned figures like Joseph for the shadows. His nickname, Piney, and his reputation for calm in crisis carried currency in the underworld, but they did not translate easily into media iconography. When documentaries and books revisited the Gotti-era, he tended to appear as a supporting character, a reminder that behind the cameras, favorite subjects stood older men whose habits had been formed in decades when discretion was prized. For communities that had lived under the shadow of organized crime, however, the difference between those in the spotlight and those behind the scenes mattered less than the cumulative impact of their collective decisions. Shopkeepers remembered envelopes handed over under implied threat. Workers recalled union meetings where dissenting voices were marginalized or intimidated. Families of those drawn into gambling or high-interest debt spoke of long struggles to recover. In oral histories and local accounts, Joseph's name sometimes surfaced as one among several associated with particular neighborhoods or unions, part of a network of influence that shaped everyday life in ways outsiders did not always see. In the end, Joseph's story is inseparable from the larger narrative of 20th century American cities. The arrival of immigrant families, the stratification of opportunity, the growth of parallel power structures, and the gradual assertion of federal authority over criminal enterprises that had once believed themselves secure behind local loyalties and corrupt arrangements. His death in a quiet federal medical facility in Missouri might seem an anticlimax compared to the dramatic images that accompanied the fall of others in his world. But it is, in its own way, emblematic. For all the notoriety that surrounded the mafia, many of its leaders' final years were spent not in cinematic showdowns, but in long, slow confrontations with aging, illness, and institutional walls. Looking back across the arc of his life, from a 1917 birth in an immigrant household, through the Prohibition aftermath and the Great Depression, into the high tide of post-war organized crime and the eventual tightening of the law's grip, Joseph Armone's legacy is not one of glamour, but of caution. It shows how individual ambition, exercised within a system built on exploitation, can yield power and wealth for a time, yet leave a trail of damage that eventually demands accountability. It illustrates how the state, often slow to perceive and respond to new forms of criminal organization, can nonetheless evolve, drawing on the hard lessons of earlier failures to confront entrenched networks. And it reminds us that behind every headline about a mob boss or a major trial lies a complex web of ordinary lives altered by decisions made in back rooms and whispered phone calls. For viewers trying to understand not just who Joseph was, but what his life meant, the lesson is less about one man's rise and fall than about the structures that made such a life possible, and the collective efforts required to dismantle them. His story, drawn from court documents, investigative records, and the broader history of his era, stands as a window into a world that is now receding but whose echoes remain, in legal codes, in institutional safeguards, and in the memories of neighborhoods that once lived, quite literally, under its shadow.